All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we're talking all about Calvin Ridley and the possibility that his time in Atlanta is over.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me, I'm Aaron Freeman, been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong, however, on Twitter at falcfans, and of course, the host of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And I always thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day on the variety of podcast platforms that you are subscribed to, whether that's Apple, Odyssey, Google, or Spotify. And of course, Locked On Falcons is also free and available for those of you watching on YouTube. Of course, make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel and give us a like when you do. So, guys, we'll be talking all about Calvin Ridley on today's episode. And we'll be sort of touching upon Steve Wyche going on 92.9 the game earlier this week and talking about the potential for the Falcons and really to be parting ways this offseason. We'll get into how I was wrong on that very subject, talking to a listener in the spring who opined that the Falcons should trade Calvin Ridley then, and we'll revisit that topic. And I went on a little bit of a rant. So I will revisit that, and then we'll talk about sort of what's next for the Falcons when it comes to potentially replacing Calvin Ridley this offseason, as well as potentially what they could get back for him. But before we get into sort of the Calvin Ridley stuff, I do want to give you guys a little bit of an update on the news. Before we get into that, I do want to plug that I don't often plug on the podcast, a new column I have at the Falcoholic coming up probably today, as most of you guys are listening to this on Friday, about how important a game this is for Caleb McGarry to perform against Cameron Jordan, and this may be his last chance to prove himself this season. So I think it's worth your time to go check that out at thefalcoholic.com. In other news, the Falcons did get positive news on their injury report on Thursday, with Kyle Pitts being limited with that hamstring injury, which seemingly is very positive in terms of putting him back on track to play potentially on Sunday. I was very pessimistic about that earlier in the week, but this is certainly positive news. I wasn't necessarily expecting him to play in practice at least until Friday and then maybe be listed as a game time decision or something like that. So the fact that he was able to return even on a limited basis on Thursday certainly is positive in that regard. And other injury news, Jalen Mayfield, the Falcons rookie left guard, was out on Thursday with a back injury, presumably something that he suffered in Wednesday's practice. That's usually not a positive sign when the player gets hurt in the middle of the week and gets added to the injury report. But we'll just sort of have to see how that goes. If he's not ready to go, Kobe Gossett presumably would be the guy stepping in for him. Kobe Gossett did get a couple of snaps against the Bills, struggled in those snaps, but we'll sort of see if he does get an extended look on Sunday, how he looks. Longtime listeners know that I am been of the opinion since we added Kobe Gossett in September that he's probably a better alternative to Jalen Mayfield. Clearly, the coaching staff does not agree with that, but potentially we may find our answer on Sunday. So we'll have to keep an eye on that. And the other news that came out on Thursday was Marvin Hall was released from the Falcons practice squad. And Marvin Hall is essentially the player that the Falcons signed to replace none other than Calvin Ridley when they put him on the non-football illness list or injury list that he went on mid-season. And so that's the end of that chapter of Marvin Hall's return to Atlanta, much to my chagrin. But I will continue to be a big fan of Marvin Hall and hope he lands on his feet elsewhere in the NFL. But that gets us to Calvin Ridley. And let's be clear on what we do and don't know. And we still don't know much when it comes to Calvin Ridley. But we don't really have any better a clue on what's going on with Calvin Ridley today than we did at the end of October when he went on that NFI list. And it has led to many people speculating in the time since that Ridley will no longer be a Falcon. And that only continued this week when Steve Wyche, former AJC reporter, does current work for the NFL Network, as well as AtlantaFalcons.com, went on the Dukes and Bell show on 92.9 The Game on Tuesday and talked about this. And for those of you that only listen to the podcast, this is what you're missing by not subscribing to the audio version of the podcast, because I have his quote to a question that he was asked on the air on Tuesday by Mike Bell, asking, is his future in jeopardy right now, referring, of course, to Calvin Ridley. And I'll read the quote for you audio listeners, but of course, this is why you should subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel so that you can read it yourself. But I'm sure many of you guys are saying, I didn't come here to read, Aaron. But Steve Wyche answered, is Calvin Ridley's future in jeopardy? He said, yes, I would think so. I don't know everything that's gone on here. For him not to surface or for the team not to say anything about it all season long leads me to believe that at some point his side believes he needs a fresh start, or the Falcons might feel like we need a fresh start. It would be hard to think, with everything that this team is trying to do with new leadership and everything, maybe if this had been a Pittsburgh situation and Arthur Smith had been the head coach here for 7 or 8 years, then maybe they could say we can bring him back. But because I think they're trying to start new and get things going, that there at some point will be some type of parting. That's my best guess. I don't know if it's going to happen, but this is the type of scenario where I think it's going to be a fresh start for him someplace else. So that's the quote that everybody's been reacting to on Twitter and elsewhere. And let's be clear about that quote. Steve Wyche said that's what he thinks is going to happen. That's his best guess. He doesn't know anything like any of us knows. And this isn't confirmation. This is basically merely speculation on his part. Is it an educated guess because Steve Wyche is a good reporter that wouldn't put out misleading information? Probably. But, let's, and this is not meant to be a knock on Steve Wyche or anything like that, but let's go back to, his reporting on the Julio trade during the draft and after the draft. It wasn't as if he was saying that trade was imminent. We only found out that trade was imminent thanks to Undisputed and whatnot. So again, it's not to sit here and say that, Steve Wyche is this incontrovertible, I can't say the word, incontrovertible evidence that this is definitely going to happen. But for the sake of today, we're going to make the assumption that Steve Wyche's instincts on this issue, his best guess, is the correct one, and that the Falcons are likely going to lead to trading Calvin Ridley this offseason. And obviously, the more the team and or Ridley continue to be quiet, the more empty that void is going to get filled with speculation that they are headed in this direction to a parting of ways. Obviously, either side of this could easily nip this in the bud immediately, but if they don't, we will certainly have people reading into that. So it runs counter to something I said on a recent episode where I was basically assuming that Ridley would be back in 2022 until I hear different. And for the time being, we're going to assume that this is the something different. Again, it doesn't mean that he's definitely done in Atlanta, but we may be moving in that direction. And of course, time is going to tell as this thing unpackages and unravels over the next couple of weeks and months. And I think a lot of people had believed this all along, that this was going to end this way once Calvin Ridley did step away from the team in the middle of the year. And some of you, including a listener, were saying like, oh, it wasn't even the middle of the year that you needed to know this. We should have been looking to trade Calvin Ridley back in March. And I went on a rant about how crazy that idea was back on a podcast in March. And now through the power of a hindsight, that was very wrong. And it's rare instances on this podcast that I admit when I was wrong about a thing, but that's what we're going to do as we continue today's episode. And we'll talk about why I was wrong. And one of the things I like to do is figure out how and why I got a certain thing wrong, because it so rarely happens. It's like lightning. We got to investigate it. But I think there are some important lessons to learn as we continue today's Locked On Falcons on how I got that wrong before. But before we get into all of that, guys, again, want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And of course, always have recommendations for what your second listen should be. And today I'm recommending the Locked On Braves podcast, where you can get insights on all the things going on with my cousin Freddie and all the latest for this Braves during the middle of their offseason by checking out Locked On Braves on your favorite podcast platform, as well as on YouTube by subscribing to the Locked On Braves YouTube channel. So, guys, Built Bar is always unveiling brand new flavors, and they have a new one with the Crave Bar. It's a healthy candy bar-like snack that satisfies, if you get my drift. It contains caramel and peanuts, just like that candy bar that satisfies. But Built Bars, these best-tasting protein bars on the market, are better than candy bars because they're healthy, too. They're low in sugar, calories, and carbs. High in protein and fiber. The Crave Bar specifically has half the sugar, half the calories, and 4 times the protein of that candy bar that satisfies. But it's not just the Crave Bar. There's other flavors at built.com, like ruby chocolate, lemon dip cheesecake, eggnog, coconut brownie chunk, caramel macchiato, coconut almond, peanut butter brownie, salted caramel, double chocolate, cookies and cream, and so much more. Choose your favorite or build your own box by heading to built.com right now and use the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off your first order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at built.com. So you guys know that, traffic is rough, right? You Atlanta residents know it better than anybody else, probably anybody else on the planet. But all around the world, you wind up being stuck in bumper to bumper traffic or constantly filling up because you're owning some type of vehicle that's a gas guzzler, and you constantly feel like you're flushing money down the toilet at the gas pump. But there's a new app called Get Upside that allows you to save every time you fill up. Get Upside is a free app. There's no catch. You can go to the App Store or Google Play and download it right now. And the thing that works with Get Upside is you get 25 cents back per gallon. A couple of days ago, I was out running some errands and I saw my gas light come on. And I was like, oh, I gotta fill up. I forgot to fill up. So I just, parked, brought up the app on my phone, looked up the nearest gas station. There's thousands of locations all across the country, and found one, 5 minutes away, drove down the street, filled up. And you can then have that money transferred directly into your bank account. I like putting them on an Amazon gift card so I can go ham there. And so you get up to 25 cents back per gallon every time you fill up. And then when you sign up now with the Get Upside app and use the promo code touchdown, you get a bonus 25 cents back per gallon on your first fill up. So that's up to 50 cents back per gallon. So don't pay full price at the pump anymore. Download the free Get Upside app in the App Store or on Google Play. Again, that's Get Upside, promo code touchdown to get a bonus 25 cents back per gallon so that you can start saving every time you fill up. So going back to the month of March, almost a year ago, 10 months ago, we had a listener by the name of Andrew G at Drewski411 on Twitter send in a mailbag question on March 3rd. And I went on a little bit of a rant on the following day's episode on March 4th. And I think you can go back and listen to that episode. And I think the rant starts around the 18 to 20 minute mark or so and goes about 15 minutes to the end of the show on that March 4th episode. But I'll read Andrew's original tweet to take you back in time to the context of that rant. So Andrew said, would it be beneficial to trade Calvin Ridley now after activating his 5th-year option? In 1 to 2 years, he will be paid like a top 5 player, but is he a top 5 player in the league? Could we realistically trade him for a mid-first to late first to get Bateman or Devontae Smith? So going back to that rant, I 100% stand by the rant that I made at the time. And the core of it was based off of 2 issues. Why do Falcon fans always suddenly get stingy about paying their homegrown talent? And basically, does it really matter if Calvin Ridley is not a top 5 receiver, if he's only a top 10 receiver? And the other issue was saying that, Calvin Ridley had 5 prime years left, moving forward. And of course, it made sense to keep him in town because he's a known commodity there, not only in the scenario where Matt Ryan remains your quarterback and you give him a reliable option to throw to that we know. And now we're sitting here, 10 months later saying Matt Ryan needs that type of player. in the offense or in the world, again, because this was, 6 or 7 weeks before the draft, in a world where the Falcons went with a quarterback at that time, you would have Ridley basically being that number one receiver for that young quarterback, much like what Roddy White was to a young Matt Ryan during his formative years. So, again, if you want to go check out that rant, but, obviously during the course of what I was saying, all of that looks very wrong, particularly the point I made during that rant, which was that when I was looking at the roster then, the only players that I knew that would be on the roster 2 years from that point, so, a year and a half from now, or almost a year from now, would be Calvin Ridley along with Chris Lindstrom and AJ Terrell. And obviously now that looks extremely wrong because we're talking about potentially moving on from Calvin Ridley. But, most people would chalk up when they get things like this wrong to, yeah, you win some, you lose some. But I always like to figure out how and why I got things wrong. And for me, when I look at this, I think the first reason, there's two reasons again. The first reason is that Calvin Ridley's mental health break was pretty much a unprecedented event. We know players will miss time due to injuries. We know players will miss time due to contract disputes. Those are pretty much everyday occurrences in the NFL. So if you had, run up to me and told me, hey, I'm from the future, Aaron, Calvin Ridley's only going to play 5 games, I would have assumed it would have been injury related or whatever the case may be. And so the fact that he took a break from football is pretty surprising. And I don't want to make that seem like it's, something bad or wrong. Like, one of the things we've talked about is doing a better job, not only when it comes to athletes, but, everybody, with normalizing mental health and the need for people to work on these types of things, because everybody struggles with these things from time to time. So it's not to sit here and say that Calvin Ridley, taking a break from football is something wrong that happened. But, as I view it, if you had told me that, Andrew, a year ago, I would have been like, crazy is probably not the right word I should use in this context, but like, that's just basically a random, unprecedented sort of event occurring. And so the fact that I got that wrong because I didn't see that coming is not something that I'm going to lose too much sleep over. The second issue is, and I think I made the same mistake that I think a lot of us were making at the time, was assuming that Calvin Ridley would work very well in Arthur Smith's offense, given what we had seen from him from the 3 previous years under Steve Sarkisian and 2 years under Dirk Cutter. And I was very confident at that point in time that you would see Calvin Ridley to continue to ascend as one of the top wide receivers in the NFL, as he had shown himself to be over the final 6 or 7 game stretch in 2020, and thus the Falcons would be certainly in the market to paying him this current offseason coming up, but at that time the next offseason following this 2021 season. So if you had told me in the final 6 to 7 games of 2020 that where Calvin Ridley without Julio Jones had been and we saw him be one of the 5 to 10 most productive receivers in the NFL, and you had told me that he would go from that to what he was in 2021 under Arthur Smith, where, again, in 2020, during those last 6 or so games, he was putting up numbers comparable to what Stephon Diggs, a all-pro, did last year, first team all-pro did last year, to basically going to what he looked like in the 5 games he played in Arthur Smith's offense, which was basically what Russell Gage looked like in 2019 in his first year as a starter. And if you had told me that would have happened, I would have been dumbfounded. And again, this is the part of the conversation when it comes to Calvin Ridley that no one wants to talk about. Like, how do we explain that? And the assumption is going to be, well, it had to do with the off-field stuff, right? And I say, maybe, again, don't know enough about what he's been dealing with off the field to know if that played a major factor in it. And I don't want to speculate on it one way or the other, as others will probably do. Instead, I look at it and I say, what I know on the field from watching the film is that Arthur Smith wasn't necessarily utilizing him correctly. And this is not going to get talked about at all now at this point in time, especially not now, because it doesn't fit the narrative, and particularly the narrative that we've been talking about all year long on this podcast with this team, about that narrative of that this team just doesn't have enough talent and Arthur Smith's offense can't work without more talent. And this is why I continue to push back against this. Again, over and over again, if you want to sit here and say Dean Pease defense doesn't work because they don't have enough talent on that side of the ball, 1000% agree with you. But if you're going to sit here and tell me that Arthur Smith's offense, it's a talent issue that's holding back this offense led by Arthur Smith, I sit here and I go, maybe, certainly there are certain areas where this team does need to get better on the offensive side of the ball, particularly up front. But we had a very talented player in Calvin Ridley that looked like, again, Stephon Diggs caliber player, one of the best route runners in the league, under previous regimes. And then he gets into Arthur Smith offense and he's just another guy. And so this idea that, just get Arthur Smith a couple more talented players and everything's going to start cooking doesn't really pass the smell test when you start to consider some of those things. And what we're going to wind up doing when it comes to Calvin Ridley is focusing a lot on, oh, he wasn't this. He wasn't a guy that could win in the air. He wasn't a guy that could win contested catch situations. He wasn't great after the catch or whatever the case may be. And no one's going to have a conversation on what Calvin Ridley is. And this is the point I was making more than a year ago, before Andrew's question, which was, people are going to focus on Calvin Ridley's not Julio Jones, because people have gotten so used to what Julio Jones is, and that's what they think is a number one receiver supposed to be, and not focus on what Calvin Ridley's strengths really are. And he's one of the better route runners in the NFL. He wins with separation. He's not going to win in the air. If you're trying to throw jump ball passes to him, that's not going to work for him. But it didn't matter because Dirk Cutter knew how to use him. Steve Sarkisian knew how to use him. Arthur Smith didn't quite know how to use him. And so it just begs the question that just putting talent on this roster and all of their problems are going to go away doesn't really work in all situations. So we'll just sort of have to see how that plays out. But I think that should really give a lot of you pause, particularly if you're not a homer. Now, if you're a homer, then you're just going to sit here and dismiss everything I say, because how dare you, Aaron, question the greatness of Arthur Smith. But if you're not a person that's just going to automatically assume everything's going to work out for the Falcons, and you actually, think about football and this team on a slightly more deeper level than that, then that is something that you need to, reconcile. How do you reconcile that? And obviously you guys have heard me give my opinion on that, but that is something that I think everybody out there needs to ask themselves. So, I know to you, Andrew, this doesn't sound like much of an apology, but I do apologize to you. And what I will say is the rant was not necessarily directed at you. It's certain things that always trigger me. Like it's not you specifically, but you said a thing in that tweet that triggered me. And it was basically the whole notion of, like, he's not a top 5 receiver. Why pay him like a top 5 receiver? And this is why, like, the thing that triggers me is I think fans get too obsessed with rankings and whatnot. And this is why, like, your job, you should be paid like a number 1 wide receiver if you act like a number 1 wide receiver. And what Calvin Ridley had done down the stretch in 2020 was be a number 1 wide receiver. Again, I'm not going to, I could go on another 30-minute rant about that. But so I apologize to you, Andrew, if you felt some type of way. And yes, you did wind up being right, because now the Falcons are in a predicament where if they trade Calvin Ridley, they're probably not going to get the return on him that they could have gotten last year if they had just followed your advice and traded him then, and probably would have gotten a first round pick for him. And we've talked about that before on the podcast, that, getting a first round pick for him in the trade right now is probably not in the cards. Maybe they get a second round pick, but we'll talk about that, as well as some potential options for the Falcons in free agency and the draft moving forward as we wrap up today's Locked on Falcons. But as we move forward on Locked on Falcons, we got to move forward in the NFL season. And we just got one more week of the regular season to be played. And of course, the Falcons are 4-point underdogs to the New Orleans Saints. And regardless of where you land on whether the Falcons will cover that spread or the Saints will cover, the best place to go, the number 1 spot for all your sports betting action this season, is, of course, BetOnline.ag. They got a new updated desktop and mobile website at betonline.ag, and you can bet on all your favorite sports, whether it's football, basketball, hockey, boxing, UFC, all the way to your favorite Vegas casino games. So head on over to betonline.ag and sign up. And when you do, use the promo code Locked On. You'll get a 50% welcome bonus. That means if you deposit $200, you get $100 in free money to play with that you can put towards the Falcons or the Saints. You can put it on the Georgia Bulldogs, the Alabama Crimson Tide, whatever you want at betonline.ag. They got you covered. So don't wait to take advantage of all the amazing offers available at BetOnline, where the game starts. So we're only beginning to unpack this when it comes to Calvin Ridley. And it's going to continue to be a developing thing. So I'm not going to, if you're going to sit here and expecting me to say, we're going to trade him for this and we're going to get this guy to replace him and we should draft this guy, I don't have those answers for you right now. This is an ongoing thing, and it's going to be a developing story as we get through the offseason. And again, we may be at a point next week where we're sitting here saying, Calvin Ridley's coming back or whatever the case may be. I because of the Julio Jones saga, because I spent a week basically saying, I think Julio's going to be back. And then the very next week, the undisputed thing happened. And I was like, I guess Julio's gone, So I am wary of definitively falling on one side of the fence or the other when it comes to that. But we know that, whether Ridley's here or not, the Falcons are going to need to add weapons to their offense to support Matt Ryan. And it's not just Matt Ryan, because again, ongoing topic of discussion that we're going to have this offseason is whether or not, we're about to see Matt Ryan's final game in Atlanta this weekend. I don't think they will, but if this game is not his last game, then I think we may see his last game come next season. And so whether it's Ridley or somebody else, you want to see that new quarterback come in and have an established group of weapons to throw to, and not be in a situation like you see in Jacksonville, where Trevor Lawrence doesn't really have anybody to throw to over there, and that's leading to some of his struggles over there. So as that goes, the big topic I think is going to be with not just finding a number one receiver to replace Calvin Ridley. I think really the expectation is probably going to be, as if it all plays out, if I was making an educated guess at this point in time, like Steve Wyche, you're probably going to have to rely heavily on Kyle Pitts being that go-to number one option in your offense. And whether or not in year two, after, going through the ups and downs of being a rookie, can he be that consistent guy week in and week out that can get you the 8 to 12 targets, the 6 to 8 catches, the 60 to 100 yards each and every week, and multiple touchdowns to be that number one guy that Calvin Ridley was in the second half of 2020, and that Julio Jones was predominantly for the previous 7 or 8 years, and Roddy White was. So I don't necessarily expect the Falcons to find that guy this offseason to come in and be that number one guy. If anybody's going to be that number one guy on the 2022 team, I think Kyle Pitts is probably going to be that guy, and going to have to be that guy. So we'll see about that. I'm optimistic that Kyle Pitts will make that growth, but we'll just sort of have to see how that goes. Now, let's talk about what we would get back if we traded Calvin Ridley. I've already touched upon this on a previous episode, I think last week on a Q&A that I did. And I talked about how at a minimum, you need to get a second round pick for him. Again, I don't think you're going to get a first round pick at this point in time, given all that's happened with Ridley this offseason. Again, these are not the best terms of using it, but, I don't want to say damaged goods, but like, you're not going to get him at his peak market given the type of performance that he had earlier this season. So you're probably, your best case scenario is getting a early second round pick, which again, I think at this point in time, you'd be doubtful for. Maybe it's a conditional pick that you get for him, but it's not going to be a conditional pick in this year's draft. That's going to be a 2023 conditional pick, because the condition is going to be based off of how many snaps he plays, what achievements he has, how many yards he has in this 2022 season. So you're not going to be able to know the conditions of that until 2023. So we can sit here and speculate about teams that would like to trade for Calvin Ridley. I haven't really done a deep dive on all the team needs across the league, but I know Jacksonville is a team that certainly is hurting for a wide receiver group. or to enhance their wide receiver group. Speaking of Trevor Lawrence, and they do have 2 third-round picks. They have 4 6th-round picks, so they could certainly put together an impressive package to Atlanta if they wanted to trade for Calvin Ridley. Does having those extra thirds mean that they're more willing to part ways with their, that 2nd-round pick that's at the top of the 2nd round, maybe, or maybe they are willing to give you a third and throw in one of those day 3 picks on the back end to sweeten the pot, or whatever the case may be. Again, I don't know. We can endlessly speculate about it, but I wouldn't necessarily go into it thinking that we're going to get a top 15 pick is basically the lesson I'm trying to tell you. So how do regardless of what the Falcons do get back from Calvin Ridley, how do they replace him? So obviously they have the options of not only the draft but also free agency. Of course, free agency comes first. If you want immediate impact, your probably best plan is to go to free agency, since we know draft picks typically don't hit the ground running, particularly receivers hit the ground running in year 1. Obviously, we've seen examples of players like Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, but those guys are relatively rare. Look at the other 1st-round picks in their respective draft classes, and it wasn't exactly guys that are who's who of coming out and immediately having big impact in year 1. So if you want that guy to can immediately step in and tag team with Kyle Pitts and be that sort of go-to option for Matt Ryan this upcoming season, free agency is the potential route for that. There's a lot of big names in free agency, particularly guys that can be that number 1 or number 2 type of receiver, the tag team with Kyle Pitts and be the 1 or the 2 in that 1-2 punch. You got Devontae Adams, Chris Godwin, Michael Gallup, Allen Robinson, Will Fuller, Juju Smith-Schuster, Mike Williams from the Chargers, Christian Kirk, Odell Beckham Jr. Those are some of the guys that jump to the top of the list. I'm not going to necessarily spend time speculating on who the Falcons should get. Obviously, I know some of those guys like Godwin and Gallup are dealing with injuries, which, late season injuries that do put their ability to play week 1 in jeopardy. So, they're going to miss most of the offseason, so they're not going to be able to build that rapport with Matt Ryan. So even though you would sit there and say, we can get a really talented wide receiver for cheap, how much cheaper are you actually going to get those guys, right? Calvin Ridley's making about $11 million next season. He's under contract for that. And yes, if you do trade him, you do remove that, $11.1 million in terms of guaranteed base salary off your books, and you save that amount of space. But I don't know, even for guys like Godwin and Gallup, that you're going to be saving considerably more money by moving Ridley and replacing him with one of those guys, because you look at what Will Fuller signed this past offseason. He signed a 1-year, $10 million deal in a depressed offseason where there was a depressed cap. And now that the cap has bounced back a little bit, I would not expect some of these guys, even if they do sign 1-year prove-it deals, to sign for considerably cheaper than that, particularly this caliber. So you might wind up paying more money to the guy that you replace Calvin Ridley with, even if it's a 1-year sort of prove-it deal, than you would if you just kept Calvin Ridley. So that's just something to keep in mind when it comes to that. If you're feeling some type of way about giving out a big, guaranteed long-term contract to one of these other guys like a Devontae Adams or an Allen Robinson, etc. And the other question about free agency is, how does this impact the negotiations with Russell Gage? It seems like the Falcons would be more inclined to bringing Russell Gage back via free agency than they would before, where you kind of thought, well, we're getting Calvin Ridley back. We need to find a capable young number 2 that can kind of step in, and we can live with, that number 2 rookie in the draft, having some growing pains in year 1, because we have Calvin Ridley and we have Kyle Pitts as our sort of top guys, and we just kind of need a guy to be the 3rd guy, and he can sort of pick and choose his spots like Russell Gage has done over the years. But now if Ridley's gone, it's just Kyle Pitts and Frank Darby and Olamide Zaccheaus if you tender him as a restricted free agent, and that's about it that you in terms of guys you have under contract. Hayden Hurst's a free agent, Lee Smith's a free agent, Parker Hesse, I think, might be a free agent or exclusive rights free agent. So it does mean that, do you put all your eggs in the draft basket? Because that means you got to sign somebody in free agency, right? So does that mean Russell Gage comes back? And then if you're Russell Gage, like, you're sitting here based off of your production down the stretch, you're like, pay me money. Like, you're not making 14, 15 million a year, but I think it's realistic to think that Russell Gage could potentially get $8 maybe $9-10 million a year on the open market from some team based off of his production, and certainly from the Falcons, you would kind of demand that. So that's going to be interesting to see if the Falcons are a lot more willing to acquiesce to Russell Gage's potential market value, if it is that high. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's like $5 or $6 million a year. But my best guess, based off of some of the recent contracts that we've seen signed, that, even a decent number two, and in this case, Russell Gage would be asking for number two wide receiver money, because he's like, I'm going to be the number two to Kyle Pitts. Is about $8-10 million a year, if not more. So we'll see how that goes. And then, of course, in the draft, I haven't studied this draft class. I've seen a couple of the early round, prospects, the wide receivers from Ohio State and Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. I've seen Burks from Arkansas and a couple of others. So I'm not completely unknown about, but I don't know how deep this draft class goes, because it gets back to the topic of conversation that we've been having on this podcast for weeks, right? Where if you lose Russell Gage, if you lose Calvin Ridley, all of a sudden wide receiver becomes a huge priority, when we went into the offseason feeling probably more inclined to be like, we need to address our offensive line on offense. We need to address our defensive line on defense, and maybe get a playmaker or two in the secondary, and maybe get a potential stopgap at linebacker, or whatever the case may be. And now we're adding wide receiver to the shopping list that we need to get. And that's going to be a potentially significant investment. And if you're investing first round picks in a wide receiver, or a second round pick in a wide receiver, that's a first or second round pick that you're not investing in some of those other areas that I'm sure many of you think are more problematic right now than a wide receiver group. And so that gets back to the quandary I've been talking about for weeks and weeks, where it's like this dilemma that this team has to be in, where they are stuck trying to figure out, okay, how much do we invest in getting weapons around Matt Ryan? Or do we just kind of say, screw it, and we'll just go with replacement level players at that wide receiver position, and a green rookie, we'll wait till round 3 or wait till round 4 to take a rookie and hope that we land a good player. And some of the free agents I talked about were second and third round picks. So it's not as if, like, waiting in after round 1 that you can't get really good wide receivers in the draft. That's one of the reasons why you've heard me in the past say, you don't need to use, your number 1 pick on a wide receiver. You can get quality talent on day 2 and potentially on day 3 of the draft. But you do wonder what the Falcons' plan is going to be. So this Calvin Ridley situation is, something that we're going to continue to discuss as we get more information. Hopefully we get more information in the coming days and weeks. But obviously we're going to have to just see how this team figures this out. This is certainly not something that's helping the Falcons. And I'm sure there's some of you out there like, good riddance, or thanks for the cap space, or whatever the case may be. This is a positive move for the Falcons. But for me, I look at it and I'm like, I don't see how this is a positive move for the Falcons, where they're losing one of their more talented players, particularly when we're spending all this time, as we have this season, allegedly saying that the reason why this team is not performing up to beyond their current expectations is because they lack talent. So we'll just sort of have to see how it all unfolds, guys. And of course, there will be a lot more to say about this in the coming days and weeks here on the Locked On Falcons podcast. Of course, that will do it for us today. We'll be back on Sunday to give you a rapid reaction to whatever happens between the Falcons and Saints. If you want sort of my official expectation, I do not expect the Falcons to win. I think the Saints will probably win in a sort of close 1-score ball game, but we'll just sort of have to see. I would love to be wrong on that, but my sort of final prediction is something like a 20-16 loss for the Falcons, but we'll just sort of have to see how that all plays out. And we'll be back on Sunday evening to probably later Sunday evening, because it's a 4:00 game, probably around 10 or 11, to give you the lowdown on what happened in that game. And of course, we'll have more to unpack next week when we can now look back at the 2021 season as a whole, and we'll have some guests to come on and give their thoughts on all the things that happened this past season. So that will be where we end it. Of course, you can send in any questions and comments that you may have via Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons, via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com, or you can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. I know I promised that today would be probably a Q&A, so we will have to get to your questions a little bit later next week if you send those in, but certainly there will be plenty of opportunity for you guys to send in those questions, and there'll be plenty of opportunities for you guys to check out further listens here on the Locked On Podcast Network, and that includes the Locked On Bets podcast that I continually plug at the end of each and every show. Of course, handicapping expert Lee Sterling is giving you those daily picks, those blowout specials in that lock of the day. That's helping you put more money in your pocket when you go and sign up at betonline.ag and use that promo code Locked On for that 50% welcome bonus. Lee is giving you all the tips and tricks that you need to make money and really make BetOnline work for you this season, whether we're talking about football, basketball, etc. So Lee's doing that every single day. So just because the football season is over doesn't mean that Lee isn't out there trying to help you guys make more money. So that will do it for us here on Locked On Falcons, guys. I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll be back on Sunday with a rapid reaction. Appreciate it, guys. Till then.